My daughter's youth pastor offered her special mentoring, and I discovered what that really meant. I was folding laundry in the living room when my 16-year-old daughter, Iris, came home from youth group looking happier than I'd seen her in months. She practically floated through the door with this glow about her that immediately caught my attention. When I asked about her evening, she mentioned that Pastor Dominic had offered her a special mentoring opportunity for students showing spiritual leadership potential. My first reaction was pride, because Iris had been struggling with confidence after a difficult breakup, and any positive attention seemed beneficial at the time. Pastor Dominic explained it would involve weekly one-on-one sessions to develop her testimony and prepare her for a youth ministry leadership role. The way Iris described it made it sound like an honor, something only a select few students were offered. She showed me a printed schedule he'd given her with meeting times always listed as Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. at his office in the church annex building. I remember thinking how organized and professional it seemed with official church letterhead and everything. Over the next few weeks, Iris attended these mentoring sessions faithfully, always coming home energized and talking about spiritual growth concepts I didn't quite understand. She'd mentioned things like discovering her true calling and learning to surrender completely to guidance from spiritual authority. The language felt slightly off to me, more intense than typical youth group discussions, but I attributed it to my own lack of recent church involvement. My ex-husband had been the religious one in our marriage, and after our divorce 3 years ago, I'd maintained Iris's church attendance more out of routine than personal conviction. Pastor Dominic had actually been helpful during that difficult transition, offering family counseling sessions that Iris found comforting. He was in his early 30s, charismatic and well-liked by both the youth and their parents. Everyone spoke highly of his dedication to the teenage members of our congregation, often mentioning how he went above and beyond typical pastoral duties. One evening, about a month into the mentoring, I noticed Iris had started dressing differently for these Wednesday sessions. Instead of her usual jeans and oversized hoodies, she was wearing dresses and putting on makeup, which seemed unusual for a church meeting. When I commented on it, she got defensive and said Pastor Dominic had explained that presenting yourself well was part of respecting the sacred space of spiritual mentorship. The explanation made a certain kind of sense, though something about it nagged at me. She also mentioned he'd asked her not to discuss the specific content of their sessions with others, including me, because the mentoring involved personal spiritual matters that required confidentiality to be effective. This bothered me more directly because I'd always maintained open communication with Iris about everything, but she assured me it was similar to confession in Catholic churches, a private space between believer and spiritual guide. I reluctantly accepted this explanation while making a mental note to pay closer attention. The following week, I decided to pick Iris up early from her session, arriving at the church annex around 8:30 p.m. instead of the usual 9 p.m. end time. The annex building was oddly dark except for a single light in what I knew was Pastor Dominic's office on the second floor. I texted Iris that I was waiting in the parking lot, expecting her to come down within a few minutes. Instead, she didn't respond for nearly 20 minutes, and when she finally emerged from the building, her hair was disheveled and she looked flustered. She claimed they'd been deep in prayer and had lost track of time, and that her phone had been on silent as required during sessions. In the car, I noticed she was wearing a silver bracelet I'd never seen before, delicate with a small cross charm. When I asked about it, she said Pastor Dominic had given it to all his mentoring students as a symbol of their commitment to the program. That night, I couldn't sleep, my mind replaying the evening's details and finding connections I didn't want to acknowledge. The next morning, I called my friend Vanessa, whose daughter had been active in the youth group until recently. I casually asked if her daughter had ever participated in Pastor Dominic's special mentoring program. There was a pause on the line before Vanessa said her daughter had been offered the opportunity, but they'd declined because the time commitment seemed excessive. She mentioned hearing from another parent that the mentoring program was relatively new, started just 6 months ago, and that only girls had been selected for it so far. This detail sent alarm bells ringing in my head because Iris had presented it as a gender-neutral leadership development program. Vanessa also mentioned that Pastor Dominic's wife had recently moved back to her parents' home in another state with their 2 young children, though the official explanation was temporary family obligations. The combination of these facts created a picture I desperately didn't want to see. I thanked Vanessa and spent the rest of the day researching warning signs of inappropriate pastoral relationships, feeling sick as I recognized multiple red flags in Iris' situation. That evening, I approached Iris directly about my concerns, explaining that the private meetings and gifts seemed inappropriate regardless of spiritual context. She became immediately defensive, almost aggressive in a way that was completely unlike her usual temperament. She accused me of being suspicious and untrusting, of trying to ruin something good in her life because I didn't understand spiritual matters. Her reaction was so disproportionate to my gentle questioning that it actually confirmed my worst fears rather than alleviating them. She said Pastor Dominic had warned her that people outside the mentoring relationship might not understand and might try to interfere out of jealousy or spiritual blindness. This language of isolation and us versus them mentality was classic manipulation, and I recognized it from the domestic violence training I'd completed as part of my work as a social worker. The irony wasn't lost on me that I could identify these patterns professionally, but had missed them in my own daughter's life until they were already deeply established. I made the decision to attend the Wednesday evening service that week, something I rarely did, positioning myself where I could observe Pastor Dominic's interactions with the youth group. What I saw made my stomach turn. He was warm and engaging with all the students, but there was a noticeable difference in how he interacted with certain girls, including Iris. He touched their shoulders, leaned in close when speaking to them, and maintained eye contact that lasted just a bit too long. With the boys and the other girls, his demeanor was friendly but appropriately distant. After the service, I watched him pull Iris aside, speaking quietly while his hand rested on her lower back in a gesture that read as far too familiar. Other parents were collecting their children and chatting in the fellowship hall, seemingly oblivious to what I was seeing. Or perhaps they'd normalized it, trusting the spiritual authority figure implicitly. I approached them, interrupting their private conversation, and announced I'd be staying for Iris's mentoring session to better understand the program. The change in Pastor Dominic's expression was subtle but unmistakable. His warm smile tightened slightly, and there was a flash of something cold in his eyes before he recovered his pastoral demeanor. He explained that the mentoring sessions were confidential by design, that having parents present would undermine the safe space needed for vulnerable spiritual discussions. He suggested instead that he could schedule a separate meeting with me to discuss the program's goals and structure. I insisted that as Iris's parent, I had the right to be present for any private meetings between my minor daughter and an adult, spiritual context or otherwise. He tried another approach, suggesting my lack of faith might create negative energy that would hinder Iris's spiritual progress. This manipulation tactic was so transparent it actually strengthened my resolve. Iris looked between us, clearly distressed, and finally said she didn't want me there, that I'd ruin everything. The level of emotional investment she had in these sessions after just a month was deeply concerning. I left the church that night but didn't go home. Instead, I parked down the street with a clear view of the annex building entrance and waited. At exactly 7 p.m., I saw Pastor Dominic arrive and unlock the annex, turning on lights as he moved through the building to his second-floor office. At 7:15 p.m., Iris arrived, and I watched her enter the building. For the next hour, I sat in my car wrestling with what to do. Every instinct told me something was wrong, but I had no concrete evidence, just a collection of red flags and gut feelings. At 8:30 p.m., I decided to enter the building. The main door was unlocked, and I climbed the stairs quietly, hearing voices from Pastor Dominic's office. The door was closed but not fully latched, leaving a narrow gap. I positioned myself where I could hear without being seen, my heart pounding so hard I worried they'd hear it. What I heard in those next few minutes changed everything, and confirmed my worst fears weren't nearly bad enough. Pastor Dominic was speaking in a low, intimate voice about how special Iris was, how mature beyond her years, how their connection transcended normal pastoral relationships. I heard him say that what they shared was blessed by God because it was pure in intention, that age and social conventions didn't matter in spiritual contexts. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and started recording the audio. Iris responded, but her voice sounded uncertain, asking if they should really be having these kinds of conversations. He reassured her that questioning was natural, but that she needed to trust his guidance, that he'd been called specifically to shepherd her through this awakening. The language was carefully constructed to sound spiritual, while clearly grooming her for something much darker. I heard movement, furniture scraping, and his voice got even quieter as he said something about showing her what spiritual intimacy really meant. That's when I pushed the door open. The scene wasn't as physically compromising as I'd feared, but it was bad enough. They were standing very close together, his hands on her shoulders, her face tilted up toward his. They jumped apart when I entered, and the guilt on both their faces told me everything I needed to know about where this had been heading. I told Iris to get her things, that we were leaving immediately. Pastor Dominic tried to de-escalate, using his pastoral voice to suggest we all sit down and discuss this misunderstanding calmly. I informed him that I'd been recording the conversation, and that I'd be taking it directly to the church board and police. His expression shifted completely, the warm pastoral mask falling away to reveal something calculating and cold underneath. He said I was overreacting, that I'd taken things out of context, that Iris was 16 and perfectly capable of making her own decisions about her spiritual journey. The fact that he emphasized her age rather than denying inappropriate behavior told me everything about his intentions. Iris was crying as we left the building, angry at me for ruining everything, for not understanding, for being controlling. The drive home was silent except for her occasional sobs. Once home, I sat her down and tried to explain what grooming was, how manipulation works, how adults in positions of authority exploit trust. She didn't want to hear it, insisting that I'd misunderstood, that Pastor Dominic genuinely cared about her spiritual development, that their relationship was pure and God-ordained. The level of psychological manipulation he'd achieved in just a month was staggering. I realized she wasn't going to hear reason from me in her current state, so I focused instead on establishing immediate boundaries. She was not to have any contact with Pastor Dominic outside my presence. She would not be returning to youth group until the situation was resolved. She would be speaking with a counselor who specialized in religious manipulation. Each rule was met with resistance and tears, but I held firm. The next morning, I called the church's senior pastor, Reverend Augustine, and requested an emergency meeting. He agreed to see me that afternoon, his tone suggesting he'd already heard from Pastor Dominic about the previous night's incident. When I arrived at his office, I found not just Reverend Augustine, but also 2 church board members present. They listened to my concerns with what appeared to be serious attention, occasionally taking notes. When I played the recording I'd made, their expressions remained carefully neutral. After I finished presenting everything I'd observed and discovered, Reverend Augustine thanked me for bringing this matter to their attention and assured me they took allegations of impropriety very seriously. However, he then explained that Pastor Dominic had already provided his version of events, describing me as a troubled, divorced woman who'd misinterpreted his pastoral care due to my own issues with male authority figures. This framing caught me completely off guard in its calculated cruelty. One of the board members, an older woman named Dorothy, gently suggested that perhaps my recent divorce had made me oversensitive to male attention toward my daughter. She pointed out that Pastor Dominic had an exemplary record of youth ministry and that dozens of young people had benefited from his mentoring over the years. The other board member noted that Iris herself had apparently told Pastor Dominic that I'd been acting irrationally lately, that I'd been struggling with empty nest syndrome as she approached college age. I realized with growing horror that Pastor Dominic had been preparing his defense by building a narrative about me to the church leadership, likely starting from the very beginning of his involvement with Iris. Reverend Augustine said they'd conduct an internal investigation, but in the meantime, it would be best if our family found another church home to avoid continued conflict. I was being quietly expelled while Pastor Dominic remained in his position, protected by institutional authority and carefully constructed narratives. I left that meeting shaking with rage and immediately drove to the police station. I filed a report detailing everything I'd observed and providing the audio recording. The officer who took my statement was sympathetic but explained the legal limitations clearly. Pastor Dominic hadn't technically committed any crimes based on what I'd described. Having private meetings with a 16-year-old wasn't illegal, nor was giving gifts or having emotionally intimate conversations. Unless there was evidence of physical sexual contact or explicit sexual communication, there wasn't grounds for criminal charges. The grooming behavior I'd described existed in a legal gray area, morally and ethically wrong, but not necessarily criminal. He suggested I could pursue a civil complaint or restraining order, but warned that would require proving imminent threat, which would be difficult given the religious context and institutional support Pastor Dominic enjoyed. I felt completely helpless, realizing the system was designed to protect institutions and authority figures, not vulnerable teenagers. Over the next few days, I threw myself into research, discovering that religious abuse and pastoral misconduct were far more common than I'd realized. Yet prosecutions were rare due to the power dynamics and community protection of religious leaders. I found online support groups for families who'd experienced similar situations, and their stories were heartbreakingly familiar. One woman named Jillian reached out to me directly after I posted my situation. She said her daughter had been involved with Pastor Dominic at his previous church 3 years ago in a different state. The situation had escalated to a sexual relationship that lasted 6 months before being discovered. The church had quietly moved Pastor Dominic rather than reporting him to authorities, and her daughter had been so psychologically damaged that she'd attempted suicide. Jillian had been fighting for years to hold the church network accountable, but confidentiality agreements and statute of limitations issues had blocked every legal avenue. She warned me that I was dealing with someone who was practiced at this, who knew exactly how far he could go without crossing legal lines. I asked Jillian if she'd be willing to speak with investigators if I could get an official investigation opened. She agreed immediately, and also connected me with 2 other families from different churches in Pastor Dominic's history who had similar stories. A pattern emerged of him targeting girls from divorced or single-parent families, girls who were searching for male approval and spiritual guidance. He'd groom them over several months, creating emotional dependency before introducing physical intimacy under the guise of spiritual connection. When relationships were discovered, he'd manipulate the narrative to make the girls appear as seducers or troubled youth with crushes that he'd tried to handle pastorally. The churches had consistently protected him, moving him to new congregations rather than reporting him, prioritizing institutional reputation over child safety. I compiled all this information into a detailed document, including contact information for previous victims willing to testify. With this evidence of a pattern, I returned to the police station and requested to speak with a detective specializing in sex crimes. Detective Farrah Kimball listened to my presentation for over an hour, reviewing the audio recording and the statements from previous victims. She was frank about the challenges of prosecuting religious authority figures, explaining that juries often gave them benefit of doubt and that defense attorneys were skilled at portraying teenage girls as unreliable witnesses. However, the pattern I'd documented across multiple churches and multiple states elevated this from a single incident to evidence of serial predatory behavior. She agreed to open an official investigation, which would include interviewing Iris, reviewing church records, and contacting the previous victims. She warned me that this process would be difficult for Iris, who was still emotionally attached to Pastor Dominic, and would likely perceive the investigation as persecution. She also cautioned that even with multiple victims coming forward, conviction was far from certain, but building a case might at least prevent him from continuing this pattern. Detective Kimball's realism was sobering, but her willingness to take the case seriously gave me the first hope I'd felt since this nightmare began. The investigation moved slowly, frustratingly so. Detective Kimball had to navigate jurisdictional issues since some of Pastor Dominic's previous offenses occurred in other states. She worked with law enforcement in those areas to compile a comprehensive case. Meanwhile, I had to deal with Iris's deteriorating mental health. She became depressed and withdrawn, angry at me for destroying what she viewed as the most meaningful relationship in her life. She insisted I'd ruined her reputation in the church community and that people were talking about her as either a liar or a seductress depending on which narrative they believed. I arranged for her to see Dr. Nina Kowalski, a therapist who specialized in religious trauma and manipulation. The first few sessions were difficult because Iris remained defensive, but Dr. Kowalski was patient and skilled at asking questions that made Iris examine their relationship from new angles. Slowly, very slowly, Iris began to recognize some of the manipulation tactics that had been used on her. It was painful to watch her process the betrayal, to see her grapple with the reality that someone she'd trusted implicitly had been grooming her for abuse. One breakthrough came about 6 weeks into therapy when Iris mentioned that Pastor Dominic had told her she was the only student he'd ever felt this kind of spiritual connection with, that she was uniquely special and mature. Dr. Kowalski asked if it was possible other girls had been told the same thing. Iris initially dismissed this, but then admitted that during one youth group event, she'd overheard another girl mention having private mentoring sessions with Pastor Dominic. The girl's name was Chloe, and Iris realized she'd been wearing a silver bracelet identical to the one Iris had received. This observation cracked open the carefully constructed narrative Pastor Dominic had built. If Iris wasn't uniquely special, if the same tactics were being used with multiple girls, then perhaps the relationship wasn't divinely ordained, but rather deliberately manipulative. This realization was devastating but necessary. Iris finally agreed to speak with Detective Kimball and provide a detailed statement about her interactions with Pastor Dominic, including the emotional manipulation and the progression toward physical intimacy. Detective Kimball interviewed Chloe and her family, discovering that Chloe's experience with Pastor Dominic had progressed further than Iris's. Chloe had been in the mentoring program for 4 months before Iris joined, and their sessions had included physical touching that, while not explicitly sexual, was clearly inappropriate. Pastor Dominic had explained it as spiritual healing, laying on of hands combined with prayer. Chloe's parents had noticed changes in their daughter but attributed them to normal teenage moodiness. When Detective Kimball explained what was being investigated, they were shocked and immediately cooperative. Chloe provided detailed statements and text messages that showed Pastor Dominic communicating with her on personal devices rather than church systems. The messages were carefully worded to sound pastoral, but had clear undercurrents of grooming. One message read, "I can't stop thinking about our last session. God has truly blessed us with this connection. Until we meet again, remember you are treasured." This kind of language created plausible deniability, while clearly establishing inappropriate emotional intimacy. The investigation expanded to include 2 more current students in the mentoring program and 3 girls from Pastor Dominic's previous churches. Each interview revealed similar patterns with variations in how far the relationships had progressed physically. The most damaging testimony came from a young woman named Bethany, who'd been in Pastor Dominic's youth group 7 years ago when she was 17. Their relationship had progressed to sexual contact, but when she tried to end it, he'd threatened to expose her as seducing a married minister, which would have destroyed her reputation in their conservative religious community. She'd kept silent for years, carrying trauma and shame that had affected her ability to have healthy relationships. She'd left the church entirely and struggled with complex PTSD. Her willingness to come forward despite the personal cost was incredibly brave. Detective Kimball used her testimony as the keystone of the case, demonstrating not just a pattern of grooming, but actual criminal sexual conduct with a minor. With Bethany's statement, they finally had grounds for charges. The arrest happened on a Sunday morning, which I later learned was deliberately chosen for maximum impact. Detective Kimball wanted the church community to witness Pastor Dominic being taken into custody, making it harder for the church to continue protecting him or dismissing the allegations as misunderstandings. I wasn't present, but Vanessa described the scene to me later. Pastor Dominic had just finished the morning sermon when police entered the sanctuary and approached the pulpit. Reverend Augustine tried to intervene, but Detective Kimball showed the warrant and Pastor Dominic was handcuffed in front of the entire congregation. Some people gasped, others cried, and apparently several of Pastor Dominic's strongest supporters shouted that this was religious persecution. He maintained his pastoral composure, even blessing the congregation as he was led out, which struck many as evidence of his innocence rather than skilled manipulation. The church community immediately fractured into those who believed the allegations and those who saw it as an attack on a godly man. The charges included multiple counts of sexual abuse of a minor, exploitation by a person in a position of authority, and child enticement. The prosecution case was strong due to the pattern evidence and multiple victims, but Pastor Dominic's defense team was formidable, funded by members of the church who believed in his innocence. His lead attorney was Gregory Vance, known for defending religious figures accused of misconduct and skilled at creating reasonable doubt by discrediting victims. The preliminary hearing was brutal. Vance painted each victim as troubled, attention-seeking teenagers from broken homes who'd developed inappropriate attachments to a caring pastor, and were now reframing those experiences as abuse due to outside influence from bitter, divorced mothers and overzealous investigators. He suggested the girls had compared notes and coordinated their stories. He pointed to the lack of physical evidence and the delayed reporting as proof that these were fabricated allegations rather than genuine abuse. The judge ultimately ruled there was sufficient evidence for trial, but Vance's strategy made it clear the courtroom proceedings would be a character assassination of everyone involved. Preparing Iris to testify was one of the hardest things I've ever done as a parent. Dr. Kowalski worked with her extensively on staying grounded during cross-examination and not internalizing the defense tactics. We practiced anticipated questions, with me playing the role of hostile attorney, asking the kinds of personal, invasive questions that would be used to discredit her. Why did you dress up for these meetings if they made you uncomfortable? If you felt something was wrong, why didn't you tell your mother immediately? Isn't it true you had a crush on Pastor Dominic? Each practice session was emotionally exhausting for both of us, but necessary. The prosecution team, led by Assistant District Attorney Lucas Wright, was supportive and careful to explain each step of the legal process. He warned us that the trial could last several weeks, and that there would be testimony and evidence that would be difficult to hear. He also explained that even with strong evidence, juries in cases involving religious figures were unpredictable, and we needed to prepare for the possibility of acquittal or partial conviction on lesser charges. The trial began on a cold Monday in November. Almost 9 months after that night, I'd interrupted Iris's mentoring session. The courtroom was packed with supporters on both sides, a visible representation of how the case had divided the community. I sat directly behind the prosecution table where Iris could see me when she needed support. Pastor Dominic's wife had returned for the trial, sitting with their children in the front row behind the defense table, a calculated move to present him as a family man. The prosecution's opening statement laid out the pattern of predatory behavior across multiple churches and multiple victims, describing a calculated predator who used religious authority and spiritual language to manipulate vulnerable teenage girls. Gregory Vance's opening statement painted a picture of a dedicated youth pastor whose care for troubled teenagers had been misconstrued by girls with crushes and amplified by parents who didn't understand appropriate pastoral relationships. He specifically pointed to me, describing me as a bitter divorcee who'd projected my own failed relationship onto an innocent mentoring connection and then created a witch hunt. The prosecution called victims in chronological order, starting with Bethany, whose case was 7 years old but involved actual sexual contact, making it the most serious criminal charge. Her testimony was detailed and compelling, describing how Pastor Dominic had groomed her through special attention, gifts, and spiritual language before progressing to physical intimacy. She explained the psychological manipulation that made her believe the relationship was blessed by God, and the threats that kept her silent after she tried to end it. Cross-examination was brutal. Vance questioned her memory after 7 years, suggested her current psychological problems were due to other factors, and implied she was seeking attention or financial compensation by coming forward now. He pointed out that she'd continued attending the church for months after the alleged abuse ended, suggesting if it had really been traumatic, she would have left immediately. Bethany held firm through most of it, though she broke down when Vance suggested she'd been obsessed with Pastor Dominic and angry when he'd tried to establish appropriate boundaries. The second victim to testify was Amelia from Pastor Dominic's second church, who'd been 15 at the time of their relationship 4 years ago. Her case was similar, grooming followed by sexual contact that stopped short of intercourse, but involved extensive touching and sexual conversation. She described how Pastor Dominic had positioned himself as the only person who truly understood her, creating emotional dependence before introducing physical elements under the guise of spiritual healing. Her parents testified about the changes they'd noticed in their daughter but hadn't recognized as warning signs until it was too late. The defense strategy with Amelia was to suggest she'd been rebellious and sexually active with peers, that she was transferring guilt about her own behavior onto Pastor Dominic. They produced her social media posts from that time period showing typical teenage attention-seeking behavior and suggested she'd been pursuing Pastor Dominic rather than being victimized by him. The prosecution objected repeatedly to this victim-blaming tactic, but much of it was allowed as relevant to establishing her credibility and state of mind. Chloe testified next. Her testimony important because it demonstrated the current pattern, proving this wasn't just historical behavior that Pastor Dominic had supposedly grown past. She described the private mentoring sessions, the inappropriate touching framed as spiritual healing, and the text messages that created emotional intimacy. The defense suggested Chloe was influenced by my allegations about Iris, that she'd reframed innocent pastoral care as abuse after hearing the accusations. They pointed out that Chloe's parents had allowed the mentoring to continue for months, suggesting they hadn't seen anything concerning in Pastor Dominic's behavior. The prosecution countered that parents trusting religious authority figures was exactly what predators like Pastor Dominic counted on, that grooming victims included grooming their families and communities. The back and forth continued for 2 days of testimony, with the defense chipping away at Chloe's credibility while the prosecution worked to establish the pattern. When Iris took the stand, I could see her hands shaking even from across the courtroom. She'd dressed conservatively in a simple blue dress, looking younger than her 16 years, which was deliberate strategy by the prosecution to remind the jury she was a child. She testified clearly about how Pastor Dominic had offered the mentoring opportunity, the escalating intimacy of their conversations, the gifts and special attention that made her feel chosen and special. She described the night I'd interrupted them, explaining that Pastor Dominic had been about to kiss her, and that she'd been confused about whether to allow it, conditioned by months of manipulation to believe this was part of her spiritual journey. Her testimony was powerful, especially when she explained how she'd initially blamed me for ruining something good, and how therapy had helped her recognize the manipulation tactics. She looked directly at Pastor Dominic when she said she'd trusted him completely, and he'd betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. Gregory Vance's cross-examination of Iris was vicious. He questioned why she'd dressed up for the mentoring sessions if she hadn't been trying to attract Pastor Dominic's attention. He suggested she'd been angry about my divorce and was seeking male approval anywhere she could find it. He pointed out that she'd defended Pastor Dominic initially and had only changed her story after months of therapy with Dr. Kowalski, suggesting I'd coerced her testimony. He noted that no actual sexual contact had occurred between them, that at most, this was a misunderstanding about the nature of their mentoring relationship. I wanted to scream at every question, seeing the manipulation in real time as Vance tried to shift blame onto a teenage girl. Iris held together better than I'd expected, though she cried several times. When Vance asked if she'd had a crush on Pastor Dominic, she said yes, she had developed feelings for him, and that he'd deliberately cultivated those feelings as part of grooming her. The prosecution had prepared her well for this question, and her answer actually strengthened her credibility. The prosecution also called expert witnesses on grooming behavior and religious manipulation. Dr. Maxwell Sinclair, a psychologist specializing in religious abuse, explained how authority figures in religious contexts use spiritual language and theological concepts to normalize inappropriate behavior and create psychological dependence. He described the pattern evident in all the victims' testimonies as textbook grooming, hitting every key element of the predatory process. He also testified about trauma responses that might explain why victims often defend their abusers initially or delay reporting. The defense's expert witness countered that mentoring relationships naturally involve emotional intimacy, and that religious contexts include physical elements like prayer and laying on of hands that might be misinterpreted by adolescents experiencing normal developmental attraction to authority figures. The battle of experts essentially gave the jury two frameworks for understanding the same behavior, which created exactly the reasonable doubt Vance was aiming for. Character witnesses for Pastor Dominic included longtime church members, parents of youth group students who'd had positive experiences, and colleagues from his seminary program. They described him as dedicated, caring, and deeply faithful, someone who'd devoted his life to helping young people navigate spiritual and personal challenges. They emphasized that dozens of teenagers had been mentored by him without any concerns, suggesting the current allegations were isolated misunderstandings or outright fabrications. The prosecution countered with character witnesses for the victims, establishing them as credible, normal teenagers with no history of false accusations or attention-seeking behavior. Teachers, coaches, and family friends testified that the personality changes observed during their relationships with Pastor Dominic were dramatic and concerning, inconsistent with normal adolescent development. The character testimony phase lasted nearly a week, with each side trying to establish whose version of reality the jury should trust. Closing arguments summarized weeks of testimony into competing narratives. Lucas Wright described Pastor Dominic as a calculated predator who'd spent years perfecting his method of manipulation, using religious authority and spiritual language to gain access to vulnerable teenage girls. He walked the jury through the pattern across multiple victims, pointing out the similarities that defied explanation if these were truly independent misunderstandings. He emphasized that the defense wanted them to believe 6 different teenage girls from 3 different churches over 7 years had all independently misinterpreted innocent pastoral care in exactly the same way, which strained credulity. Gregory Vance painted Pastor Dominic as a dedicated youth minister who'd become the victim of a moral panic, caught in a witch hunt driven by overzealous parents and encouraged by investigators looking for patterns where none existed. He suggested the similarities in the girls' stories proved coordination rather than pattern, that they'd shared details and aligned their accounts. He noted the lack of physical evidence and relied heavily on reasonable doubt, arguing the prosecution hadn't proven guilt beyond that standard. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Each day they requested clarification on different aspects of testimony or legal standards, giving no clear indication of which direction they were leaning. I barely slept during those 3 days, running through every possible outcome in my mind. Iris was a wreck, alternating between hope and despair, still processing the trauma of testifying and watching her experience dissected in public. Dr. Kowalski made herself available for daily check-ins, helping Iris manage the anxiety. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, we got word that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed again, the same community division visible in the seating. Pastor Dominic showed no emotion as the jury filed in, maintaining the pastoral composure he'd displayed throughout the trial. The foreperson stood and delivered the verdicts count by count. Guilty on 4 counts of sexual abuse of a minor. Guilty on 6 counts of exploitation by a person in a position of authority. Guilty on 3 counts of child enticement. Not guilty on 2 counts where the evidence was weaker. The courtroom erupted in response, with Pastor Dominic's supporters crying out that this was injustice, and victims' families weeping in relief. The judge called for order and immediately revoked Pastor Dominic's bail, remanding him to custody until sentencing. For the first time, his composure cracked slightly. He looked back at his wife as bailiffs approached, and I saw real fear in his expression. His wife was sobbing, and their children looked confused and scared. I felt a moment of sympathy for them before remembering they were also his victims in a different way, their lives destroyed by his choices. Iris collapsed against me, crying with a mix of relief and residual trauma. The guilty verdicts validated her experience, confirmed that what happened to her was real abuse rather than misunderstanding. That validation was crucial for her healing process. Outside the courthouse, Lucas Wright gave a statement emphasizing that justice had been served, but acknowledging the long road to healing for all the victims. Several victims' families also spoke, including Jillian, who said she'd been fighting for this outcome for 7 years and was grateful other families wouldn't have to fight alone. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, allowing time for pre-sentence investigations and victim impact statements. Each victim was invited to submit a written statement or speak at sentencing about how Pastor Dominic's actions had affected their lives. Iris spent weeks working on her statement with Dr. Kowalski, processing years of manipulation and abuse into words that captured the damage without letting it define her future. She decided to speak rather than submit a written statement, wanting Pastor Dominic to hear directly from her about the harm he'd caused. I was incredibly proud of her courage while also being heartbroken that she had to summon it at age 16. The other victims also prepared statements, each describing in detail the psychological, emotional, and spiritual damage from being betrayed by someone they'd trusted completely. Bethany's statement was particularly powerful, describing 7 years of therapy, destroyed relationships, and spiritual crisis resulting from Pastor Dominic's abuse. The sentencing hearing was emotionally brutal. Each victim's statement built on the previous one, creating a comprehensive picture of the destruction Pastor Dominic had caused across years and multiple communities. Several victims described losing their faith entirely, unable to trust religious institutions or spiritual authority figures after being betrayed so fundamentally. Others described ongoing anxiety, depression, and PTSD symptoms that affected every aspect of their lives. Iris spoke last, looking directly at Pastor Dominic as she described how he'd taken her trust, her innocence, and her sense of safety, and twisted them into tools for manipulation. She said the worst part wasn't even the inappropriate behavior itself, but the spiritual manipulation that made her doubt her own judgment and perception of reality. She ended by saying she was reclaiming her voice and her story, refusing to be defined by what he'd done to her. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom except for Pastor Dominic, who maintained a neutral expression throughout. The defense presented mitigating factors, emphasizing Pastor Dominic's lack of prior criminal record, his contributions to the community, and his own difficult childhood that had created attachment issues manifesting in inappropriate relationships. A psychologist testified that Pastor Dominic showed characteristics of dependent personality disorder, that his behavior stemmed from psychological issues rather than predatory intent. This felt like a last-ditch attempt to reframe abuse as mental illness, and the prosecution strongly objected to any characterization that diminished Pastor Dominic's responsibility for calculated, deliberate actions over many years. His wife gave a statement pleading for leniency for the sake of their children who needed their father. She claimed he'd been getting counseling and had shown genuine remorse. This rang hollow given that Pastor Dominic had maintained his innocence throughout the trial and shown no actual accountability for his actions. The judge's statement before sentencing was comprehensive and pointed. She noted that Pastor Dominic had been in a position of ultimate trust, that parents had entrusted him with their children's spiritual development and emotional well-being, and that he'd systematically violated that trust for his own gratification over many years. She emphasized that the pattern of behavior demonstrated this wasn't a one-time mistake, but a calculated method he'd developed and refined across multiple victims. She noted his lack of remorse throughout the trial and during sentencing, seeing no evidence of genuine understanding of the harm he'd caused. She sentenced him to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for the first 12 years, consecutive sentences on multiple counts. She also imposed mandatory registration as a sex offender and permanent prohibition from working with minors in any capacity. The sentence was harsher than we'd hoped for, but fair given the severity and extent of his crimes. The church community remained divided even after sentencing. Reverend Augustine issued a statement expressing sorrow about the situation, while maintaining the church had acted appropriately based on information available at the time. This was frustrating given the evidence that the church had ignored multiple warning signs and prioritized institutional protection over student safety. A group of families, including ours, left the church entirely and filed a civil lawsuit against the church organization for negligent retention and supervision. The lawsuit alleged the church knew or should have known about Pastor Dominic's pattern of inappropriate behavior, that they'd failed to conduct adequate background checks that would have revealed his history of moving between churches under suspicious circumstances. The church's insurance company initially fought the lawsuit but eventually settled for a substantial amount that was divided among the victims' families. More importantly, the settlement required comprehensive policy changes around youth protection, background checks, and reporting of concerns about staff behavior. The aftermath of the trial continued to unfold over the following years. The network of churches that had shuffled Pastor Dominic between congregations faced scrutiny from both law enforcement and media investigations. A reporter named Timothy Alvarez from a major newspaper published a lengthy investigation into the pattern of religious organizations protecting abusive clergy by transferring them rather than reporting to authorities. Pastor Dominic's case became a central example in this expose, which prompted legislative efforts to close legal loopholes that allowed this practice. Several states, including ours, passed laws requiring religious organizations to report allegations of abuse to authorities and prohibiting confidentiality agreements that prevent disclosure of misconduct. These legal changes won't undo the damage Pastor Dominic caused, but they might prevent future predators from being quietly moved to new hunting grounds. Iris's healing process has been long and nonlinear. She continued therapy with Dr. Kowalski through high school and into college, working through layers of trauma and rebuilding her ability to trust. She struggled with relationships, particularly with authority figures and in romantic contexts, understandably gun-shy after having her trust so thoroughly violated. She decided not to attend church at all for several years, needing distance from religious context while processing religious trauma. This was difficult for me to watch as I'd wanted to maintain some spiritual foundation for her, but I respected that she needed to find her own path. Gradually, she's begun exploring spirituality again on her own terms, focusing on personal practices rather than institutional religion. She says she's learning to distinguish between genuine spirituality and the weaponized version Pastor Dominic used to manipulate her. The other victims have had varied paths to healing. Bethany completed a graduate degree in social work and now specializes in helping survivors of religious abuse, turning her trauma into purpose. Amelia struggled more, dealing with substance abuse issues and several suicide attempts before finally finding stable support through a trauma-focused treatment program. Chloe moved across the country for college, wanting distance from the community where everything happened. She's doing well academically, but has cut off most contact with people from that period of her life. The girls from Pastor Dominic's other churches have their own struggles and successes connected through a private support group where they can share experiences with people who truly understand what they survived. This community has been healing for all of them, breaking the isolation Pastor Dominic had carefully constructed around each relationship. I've had my own healing process to navigate. The guilt of not seeing the warning signs earlier haunted me for years, even though every professional assured me that predators like Pastor Dominic are skilled at camouflaging their behavior. I blamed myself for not being more involved in Iris's church activities, for trusting religious authority implicitly, for not having difficult conversations earlier about manipulation and abuse. Therapy helped me work through these feelings and recognize that placing blame on myself was actually letting Pastor Dominic off the hook for choices only he controlled. I also had to process my own relationship with faith and religious institutions. I'd grown up believing churches were safe spaces, that pastors were trustworthy by virtue of their role. Discovering how thoroughly institutions protect themselves rather than victims shattered that naivety. Like Iris, I've had to rebuild my understanding of spirituality outside institutional frameworks. My work as a social worker was impacted significantly by this experience. I became passionate about training on recognizing grooming behavior and institutional abuse, developing workshops for parents, teachers, and youth workers about warning signs of manipulation. I also advocated for policy changes in youth programs, pushing for 2 adult rules that prevent private one-on-one meetings between youth and adult leaders. Some organizations resisted these policies as burdensome or based on distrust, but I've argued that protecting both youth and staff requires clear boundaries and accountability. I've also worked with several families going through similar situations, using my experience to guide them through the complex process of reporting, investigation, and prosecution. Each case is different, but the pattern of institutional protection and victim blaming is distressingly consistent across religious and secular organizations. 3 years after the trial, I attended a conference on preventing abuse in youth-serving organizations. During a breakout session, I met a woman named Paige, whose daughter had been groomed by a teacher using similar tactics to Pastor Dominic. We connected immediately, recognizing in each other the particular kind of trauma that comes from watching your child be manipulated and violated. Paige had successfully advocated for policy changes in her school district and eventually joined the board of an organization focused on child protection. She encouraged me to channel my experience into broader systemic change rather than just individual cases. With her support, I joined the board of a national organization working on model legislation for youth protection across all types of institutions. This work has been meaningful, turning our family's trauma into tangible changes that might protect other children. Iris is now in her 2nd year of college, studying psychology with a focus on trauma and recovery. She's considering specializing in religious trauma specifically, wanting to help other survivors navigate the complex process of healing from spiritual abuse. She's started speaking publicly about her experience, sharing her story at conferences and in educational settings to raise awareness about grooming tactics and institutional protection of abusers. Her courage in transforming victimhood into advocacy continues to amaze me. She's dating someone now, a relationship that's healthy and respectful, proof that she's learned to recognize and insist on appropriate boundaries. She says one positive outcome of her experience with Pastor Dominic is that she has excellent radar for manipulative behavior now, immediately recognizing and rejecting red flags that might have fooled her before. Pastor Dominic remains in prison, having lost his appeal on procedural grounds. According to the prison records that are publicly available, he's maintained his innocence and continues to receive support from a small group of church members who believe he was wrongly convicted. He's reportedly writing a book about religious persecution of Christian leaders, positioning himself as a martyr rather than taking responsibility for his crimes. This complete lack of accountability isn't surprising but remains infuriating. He'll be eligible for parole in 9 more years, and we're already preparing to make victim impact statements opposing his release. The parole board will need to see genuine remorse and understanding of harm caused before considering release, and based on his continued denial, that seems unlikely. Still, we remain vigilant, knowing the system sometimes prioritizes prison overcrowding over victim safety. The church where Pastor Dominic served during his relationship with Iris has undergone significant changes. Reverend Augustine retired under pressure from families demanding accountability. The new senior pastor, Reverend Caitlin Woods, has implemented comprehensive youth protection policies and mandatory training for all staff and volunteers. She's been transparent about the church's past failures and committed to creating a culture of safety over reputation protection. Some families have returned to the church under her leadership, while others, including ours, have found other faith communities or none at all. The congregation is smaller now, having lost members both to people leaving in disgust and people leaving because they felt the church had unfairly persecuted Pastor Dominic. This division probably won't fully heal for many years, if ever. The civil lawsuit against the church network settled for an undisclosed amount, but reports suggest it was substantial enough to impact the organization's operations. As part of the settlement, they agreed to hire independent consultants to review policies across all affiliated churches and implement standardized youth protection protocols. They also established a compensation fund for victims who hadn't participated in the lawsuit but came forward later with similar experiences. Several additional victims from Pastor Dominic's history contacted us after news coverage of the trial, describing incidents that occurred before the statute of limitations or in contexts that didn't rise to criminal charges but still caused harm. The fund provided some acknowledgement and resources for them, though nothing can truly compensate for what they lost. Media coverage of the case sparked broader conversations about abuse in religious contexts and institutional protection of predators. Several major news organizations did investigative series on patterns of religious organizations moving accused abusers rather than reporting to authorities. These investigations revealed that Pastor Dominic's case was far from unique, that hundreds of similar cases occur annually across different denominations and faith traditions. The coverage led to public pressure for legislative reform, with multiple states passing laws strengthening reporting requirements and limiting organizations' ability to use confidentiality agreements to silence victims. Federal legislation was also proposed, though it faces challenges related to religious freedom concerns. These policy changes represent progress, though they came too late for the victims in our case and countless others. Looking back now, 5 years after that night I interrupted Iris's mentoring session. I'm struck by how much has changed and how much remains difficult. The legal victory provided validation and accountability but didn't erase the trauma. Iris still has days where the past overwhelms her, usually triggered by news stories about similar cases or encounters with people who knew Pastor Dominic and still defend him. We've both learned to recognize these triggers and have strategies for managing them, but the work of healing is ongoing. I've accepted that some questions will never have satisfying answers. Why did Pastor Dominic choose to use his pastoral calling for harm rather than healing? Why did the institutions fail so completely in their duty to protect children? How many victims could have been spared if even one person in authority had acted sooner? The most important lesson I've learned is to trust instincts even when they conflict with trusted institutions or authority figures. That nagging feeling I had from the first parent-teacher conference was my intuition, recognizing warning signs my conscious mind wanted to dismiss. Parents are conditioned to trust religious leaders, teachers, coaches, and other authority figures, and predators exploit that trust systematically. Breaking through that conditioning to investigate concerns is difficult, especially when you're accused of being paranoid or overprotective. But I'd rather be wrong and apologetic than right and too late. I share this message whenever I speak about our experience, encouraging parents to investigate any situation that triggers concern, regardless of how respected or beloved the authority figure might be. Iris has given me permission to share our story publicly, believing that transparency helps prevent similar situations and supports other survivors. She's written her own account of the experience, published in a collection of survivor stories that's used in training programs for youth workers and religious leaders. Her essay emphasizes the grooming process from the victim's perspective, helping readers understand how manipulation works from the inside. She describes the confusion of having genuine feelings of connection and affection weaponized against her, the way Pastor Dominic made abuse feel like intimacy and manipulation feel like care. Her words are powerful and educational, helping others recognize the subtle tactics predators use. The support network we built during the investigation has evolved into lasting friendships. Jillian, whose daughter was victimized by Pastor Dominic years before Iris, has become a close friend and advocacy partner. Together, we've worked on several cases of institutional abuse, connecting families with resources and helping them navigate the complex systems. Vanessa, whose daughter avoided Pastor Dominic's mentoring program, has been an incredible support, never wavering in her belief and assistance. The other victims' families maintain contact through an annual gathering where we support each other and remember that we're not alone in this ongoing process. These connections, forged through shared trauma, have become sources of strength and hope. I wish I could say our story has a neat, satisfying conclusion where everyone heals completely and justice is fully served. The reality is messier and more complicated. We've achieved significant victories in legal accountability, policy changes, and personal healing. But we've also sustained permanent damage that will carry forward. Iris will always have this trauma as part of her history, shaping how she moves through the world. I'll always carry the guilt of not protecting her better, even while intellectually understanding I did the best I could with the information I had. The other victims and their families carry similar burdens, finding ways to live full lives despite the weight. What gives me hope is seeing how Iris and the other survivors have refused to be defined solely by what was done to them. They're building careers, relationships, and lives that honor their experiences without being limited by them. They're turning trauma into advocacy, pain into purpose. They're breaking the silence that protected Pastor Dominic and countless other predators, creating cultural change through their willingness to speak truth. This transformation from victim to survivor to advocate is powerful and inspiring, demonstrating the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of profound betrayal. For any parent reading this who has concerns about their child's relationship with a religious leader, teacher, coach, or any authority figure, I urge you to trust your instincts and investigate thoroughly. Don't let institutional authority or social pressure silence your concerns. Document everything. Seek outside perspective from professionals trained in recognizing abuse, and be prepared to believe your child when they disclose inappropriate behavior. The system isn't designed to support victims or concerned parents easily, so you'll need persistence and support. But your child's safety is worth any temporary discomfort or conflict that investigation might cause. The truth matters, especially when powerful people try to bury it. Our story is one family's experience, but it reflects patterns that affect thousands of families annually. By sharing our experience and advocating for change, we hope to contribute to a culture where institutions prioritize child safety over reputation, where victims are believed and supported, and where predators face swift accountability rather than quiet transfers. This cultural shift is happening slowly through the collective efforts of survivors, advocates, and allies refusing to accept the status quo. Every policy change, every successful prosecution, every survivor who finds healing represents progress toward that goal. 5 years later, I can say we've survived and are continuing to heal. The journey isn't over, and probably never will be completely, but we're moving forward with purpose and hope. Iris's strength inspires me daily, reminding me that while we can't change the past, we can shape the future. By turning our trauma into advocacy and our pain into purpose, we honor the experience without being consumed by it. That balance between acknowledgement and forward movement is perhaps the greatest achievement of our healing journey, and it's one we'll continue navigating together. If you're still here, you're a true fan. Show some support with a like and subscribe to catch the next one.